There is a box in a basement in western Pennsylvania. One word written on the side, Janet. Everyone in the family knew the rule. Do not touch it. Do not ask about it. Leave it alone. Francesco grew up seeing that box and knowing better than to go near it. He was a child when he first noticed it. He was an adult before he understood why it existed. A 23-year-old woman's life was abruptly cut short in her own home. A deep mystery was left behind in that bedroom, one that would take 34 years to fully unravel. This is the story of Janet Walsh. Her full name was Catherine Janet Walsh. She grew up in Monica, Pennsylvania, a small steel town about 30 miles outside Pittsburgh, the kind of place where your neighbors knew your parents before you were born. Janet was well-liked, not in the way people say that about someone after they're gone just to be kind. Actually, well-liked. She moved between social circles without effort. The music kids, the quieter academic crowd. She belonged in both spaces and never seemed out of place in either. She played the oboe. She sang. She played piano. But the detail people seemed to remember most was the sewing. Janet would buy fabric, come home, cut the pattern, stitch the pieces together, and wear the finished outfit out that same night. Her brother Francesco watched her do it more than once. He never fully understood how she pulled it off. Her best friend Susan lived next door. Their bedroom windows faced each other. Their mothers bought them toy princess phones so they could talk at night without leaving their rooms. They grew up that close, that connected. Susan thought of Janet as a little sister. Janet was building towards something. She just never got there. By high school, she was already in love with Scott Walsh. They were inseparable all 3 years. She signed his yearbook the same way each time. I'll always love you, Janet. They married in August 1976. Both were 20 years old. In western Pennsylvania in the 1970s, that path made sense. The steel mills were booming. A young man could walk straight from high school graduation into a paying job. Scott did that. Skipped college, went to work. The money felt steady. But the life they built together quickly cost more than they expected. A new home, 2 vehicles, a mortgage. The kind of financial pressure that doesn't announce itself all at once. It just slowly tightens. After 3 years, it became too much. In the summer of 1979, Janet and Scott separated. What neither of them knew yet was that other pressures were building too. Scott, it would later emerge, had been seeing someone else. A 17-year-old girl who had been calling him at home. He had not told anyone. And Janet, for her part, had started something new of her own, something she was keeping quiet. In a small town, people had reasons to hold things back. Everyone did. Janet was 23 and living alone for the first time. She had gone from her parents' home directly into a marriage. There had never been an in-between. Now there was one, and it felt unfamiliar. Her family noticed a quiet nervousness in her, not fear, more like someone learning to trust their own footing for the first time. She got an office job at a local refrigeration company. She built a routine. She started to look like a woman settling into something that was entirely her own. Then Labor Day weekend arrived. Friday night, August 31st, 1979. Janet went out with 3 girlfriends, multiple bars, music, dancing. The holiday weekend had opened up the night and there was no reason to be anywhere until Monday. Somewhere along the way, a man Janet had never met asked her to dance. She said yes. They danced disco. She was good on the floor, confident, relaxed. After a few songs, the man asked if she would give him a ride home. She said no. She told him her husband could get angry if he saw her with someone, that it would be better if he just left. She said she did not want him to get hurt. The man walked away. Janet and her friends kept going. They stayed out until nearly 4 in the morning on September 1st. Janet got home, walked inside, and closed the door. She was due at work in a few hours. She never made it. When Janet did not show up that morning, her boss called her mother. He said it was not like her. Janet was dependable. Her parents left immediately. Her father had a key. The front door was chained from the inside. He worked the chain loose and moved through the apartment. When he reached the back bedroom, he stopped. Janet was found in her bed, and it was immediately clear that she had been restrained. The cause of death was quickly ruled as strangulation. It was a scene of unsettling quiet, no signs of a random struggle, but rather a cold, deliberate act. She was covered by a sheet. The room was neat, almost untouched. No overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle that had broken out of control. Whatever had happened here was deliberate, controlled, quiet enough that no neighbor heard a thing. He had handled suicides. He had worked fatal accidents. He had never seen a homicide. He pulled back the sheet just far enough to see Janet's face and the bandana still around her throat. There was no need to check for a pulse. 8 hours earlier, Janet Walsh had been on a dance floor. Francesco, Janet's brother, tried to get inside the room. Family members stopped him at the door. They held on and would not let go. They did not want that image to be the last thing he carried. He never saw her. The investigators who arrived began to work the scene. Cause of death, strangulation. Time of death, approximately 5 in the morning. The bandana had not slipped or shifted. It had been held in place, deliberately, for minutes. Then came the detail that would define the entire investigation. No forced entry, not a broken lock, not a pried window. Nothing. The front door had been chained from the inside. Janet Walsh had opened that door herself. Sometime before 5 in the morning, she had recognized the person standing on the other side. She had let them in. Someone she knew came through that door. And Janet Walsh was dead before sunrise. Who opened that door, and what did they want? The husband was first. Scott Walsh had been Janet's entire romantic life since high school. 3 years of marriage. Then financial pressure and a separation. He dropped a $75 support check through her mail slot on the 1st of every month. He had been at her apartment the morning her body was discovered. He admitted it without hesitation. Then came the polygraph results. Both times, one question came back the same way. Did you kill your wife? Deception. But Scott had not been alone that night. Football game with a friend. The friend got sick. Scott drove him to a hospital and stayed until 2 in the morning. Then he went home. Then a 17-year-old girl called him. She came over. She stayed until nearly 3:30 in the morning. Scott had not mentioned her to police immediately. The girl confirmed everything when investigators found her. Scott Walsh was not cleared because police believed him. He was cleared because the evidence left no room for him. There is a difference. Investigators knew it. Here is what made everything harder. The more people investigators spoke to, the less consistent their picture of Janet became. Her family knew one version of her. Her co-workers knew another. The people she had been seeing that summer knew something else entirely. Every person they interviewed knew a slightly different Janet Walsh. None of those versions quite matched. The second name came from the dance floor. Robert McGrail was passing through Monaca. He had been at one of the bars that night. He asked Janet to dance. She said yes. They danced well. Then he asked for a ride home. She turned him down. She said her husband could get angry, that he should leave, that she did not want him to get hurt. He said he walked home alone, and that was the end of it. 6 days after the murder, a woman driving up 9th Street spotted something in the gutter. A checkbook. She picked it up. Robert McGrail's name was inside, half a block from Janet's apartment. The man who danced with her asked to go home with her and was rejected. His checkbook, sitting outside her building a week after her death. No checks written from that account since the night she died. Investigators gave him a polygraph. He failed. They would eventually track him to Massachusetts, drive 600 miles, bring a warrant, and question him for 7 straight hours. But that was years away. For now, his name sat near the top of a growing list. Then came the one that made no sense at all. Around 8 in the evening on the night Janet died. Not during the early morning hours, but hours earlier. A well-dressed young man knocked on a neighbor's door 2 houses from Janet's apartment. He asked where Janet Walsh lived. Janet was not home. She would not be home for another 8 hours. She was out with friends, moving between bars, completely unaware. The neighbor pointed toward her building. The man left. He was never found, never identified, never explained. Investigators made a public appeal. Nothing usable came back. He became known only as Sketchman. Someone knew Janet's name, needed her exact address, on the exact night she was killed, then vanished without a trace. The case had barely started, and it was already coming apart. The 4th name came from her workplace. Janet's boss was Ron Sikosi. After the separation from Scott, something had started between them. Her closest friends knew. Susan, Janet's best friend, when asked who she thought could have done this, said his name first, not after thinking about it, immediately. Ron had been at 2 of the same bars Janet visited that night. What made investigators uncomfortable was the shape of the relationship itself. Janet had been navigating something at work with no clean edges, a private arrangement that her family knew nothing about. Another side of her life that the people who loved her most had never seen. Ron was questioned. He stayed on the list. The 5th name arrived quietly. Scott Hopkins ran a home building company. He was older than Janet, established, calm. He had actually built the house Janet and Scott Walsh had shared during their marriage. That connection had led to something else during the summer of 1979. He and Janet had been seeing each other privately. When first interviewed, Hopkins was vague. He described it as casual. Under more pressure, the picture changed. There had been intimacy. At her apartment, in her bed. His alibi was detailed and consistent. His girlfriend was present. 2 employees slept on his living room floor to help with an early morning pig roast. All 3 confirmed he never left. He answered his questions and returned to his life. 4 years passed before the 6th name surfaced. By 1983, the investigation had lost whatever momentum it once had. Then a waitress came forward with something that stayed with the investigator who heard it. A man named Victor Sacozzi had been sitting in her section. He mentioned casually that he had known Janet, that he had dated her before her death. As he talked, something shifted in his expression, distant, interior, like he was watching something play back behind his eyes. He said the crime scene had been very neat, not a hair out of place. He had been at the last bar Janet visited the night she died. The investigator who read that report read it more than once, not because it proved anything, because of how it felt. Though deceit's 3 years, 20 interviews, 6 names, 0 arrests. Investigators sat across from Janet's family and delivered the words that took years to fully absorb. Even if the killer walked in tomorrow and confessed, there might not be enough physical evidence to prosecute. The case went cold. Janet stayed 23. Everyone else kept moving. The suspects built careers. Some became respected figures. Time passed the way it does when no one is ever made to stop. 27 years. Then a serologist opened a box of old evidence under new light. She found something the original investigators had missed completely. The case had been dead for nearly 3 decades. It was not finished. Behind every episode is 7 days of research, late nights, and one simple belief. These people deserve more than silence. If you think they do too, like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Which part of this case got to you the most? More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Now back to the case. The evidence had been sitting in storage for 31 years. Nobody knew it was still talking. The boxes had been preserved the way old case files always are, carefully enough to survive, quietly enough to be forgotten. Janet's nightgown, the bathrobe cord that had bound her wrists, the bedsheet that had covered her body, sealed, labeled, stored in a state police facility while the world outside kept moving, and Janet's case collected silence. The same fabric she had loved to cut and stitch, now the only thing left that could speak. In 2010, a serologist named Ashley Mangan received a federal grant to retest biological evidence in unsolved cases. She pulled the Janet Walsh materials and started looking. What she found stopped her. Not a trace. Not a faint biological hint that required careful coaxing under specialized equipment. A significant amount of biological evidence. In multiple locations on the back of the nightgown, the restraint cord, and the bedsheet. It was more than enough to construct a definitive DNA profile. 4 people had processed that crime scene in 1979. A police officer, a pathologist, a coroner, a state police criminalist. None of them had noted any of this. How do 4 trained professionals miss the same thing in 4 separate examinations? That question had no clean answer. But what it meant was clear. This evidence had survived 3 decades inside those storage boxes completely undisturbed. And now it was enough to build a DNA profile. The dead case had been keeping something. It was finally ready to give it up. The profile went into the system. Then the calls began. Scott Walsh was contacted first. He came in without resistance and gave a sample voluntarily. Not a match. Eliminated. Ron Sacozzi. Tested. Eliminated. Victor Sacozzi. Tested. Eliminated. 3 names crossed off the list that had sat untouched for nearly 30 years. Each elimination felt less like relief and more like pressure. The list was getting shorter. The remaining names were getting heavier. 2 left. Robert McGrail and Scott Hopkins. McGrail had moved to Massachusetts. 2 investigators drove 600 miles to reach him. They brought a warrant for his DNA. They also brought every question that had accumulated since 1979. The session lasted 7 hours. McGrail maintained everything he had always said. He had danced with Janet. She had turned him down. He had walked away. He did not know where she lived. He had nothing to do with her death. The DNA came back. Not a match. Robert McGrail was eliminated. Investigators had driven 600 miles based on a checkbook in a gutter and a failed polygraph from 1979. They had built years of suspicion around his name. and the biology said it was the wrong direction the entire time. Now, there was one name left. Scott Hopkins was 65 years old. He was no longer just the quiet home builder who had given a careful interview in 1979. He was now an elected councilman in Bridgewater Borough, a respected figure, someone people in the community knew by name and trusted with public decisions. Investigators contacted him and asked for a DNA sample. He refused. His explanation was immediate and calm. His DNA would be there, he said. He had been in that apartment. He had been intimate with Janet. Of course, his DNA would show up on her belongings. Giving a sample would only pull him deeper into something he had nothing to do with. It was a reasonable thing to say. It was also the response of a man who understood exactly what that evidence could mean. Investigators did not have enough for a search warrant, not yet, so they did something else. Hopkins had a habit. Every morning he came into the Bridgewater Borough building, the same building where the police department was located. He stopped at a water fountain. He used a disposable cup. Then he dropped the cup in the trash and went about his day. One morning, after Hopkins walked away from the fountain, someone was waiting near the trash. The cup was retrieved before anyone else touched it. It was tested. The DNA on that discarded cup matched the profile built from Janet Walsh's nightgown, from the cord that had bound her wrists, from the sheet that had covered her body. A court-ordered sample was taken. The results confirmed what the cup had already shown. Scott Hopkins, 31 years after Janet Walsh died in her apartment. In January 2012, Andy Gall drove to make the arrest. Gall had been 25 years old when he pulled back that sheet and saw Janet's face in 1979. He was the first officer through her door. He had carried this case through his entire career. Decades of wondering, decades of coming close and finding nothing solid enough to hold. He brought the same handcuffs he had carried in 1979. When Hopkins answered the door and saw Gall standing there, something changed in his face. Gall told him he had a warrant. Hopkins stepped back and lowered himself into a chair. He looked up and said 4 words. "You think I did this?" Not aggressive, not panicked, something quieter than that. A man who had spent 32 years as a respected member of his community, suddenly sitting down under the weight of what had just arrived at his door. Gall put the 1979 handcuffs on him, the same hands, the same metal. A circle that had taken more than 3 decades to close. November 2013. A Beaver County courtroom. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty. 3rd-degree murder. It looked like justice. But inside that verdict, something had already been planted that would take 9 more years to fully break open. A jury took 6 hours. A court took 9 years to undo it. Scott Hopkins sat at the defense table at 67 years old. Grandfather, former councilman, respected businessman. A man who had never left the county where Janet Walsh was murdered. Who had built his career here, raised his family here, served his community here for 34 years after the night she died. The prosecution had one central argument. The DNA found on Janet's nightgown, the robe cord that tied her wrists, and the bedsheet was not old. It was not left over from earlier encounters. It was deposited on the night of the murder, in those specific locations, in that specific pattern. To make that argument, they called Dr. Cyril Wecht. Wecht was one of the most recognized forensic pathologists in the country. He had worked cases involving presidents and pop stars. When he walked into a courtroom, juries listened. He described a theory he called topographical distribution, the co-location of Hopkins' DNA across multiple surfaces. The back of the nightgown, the restraint cord, the sheet, told a story. That story placed Hopkins at the scene at the exact moment of the crime, suggesting a direct link between his presence and her final moments. He argued it was highly improbable the material could have survived from a previous encounter weeks prior. The jury heard this from one of the most credentialed experts in his field. It sounded like science. It felt like certainty. The defense pushed back. They pointed to something that had been in the evidence files all along. 4 people had examined that crime scene in 1979. A police officer, a pathologist, a coroner, a state police criminalist. Not one of them had noted any biological evidence on the nightgown, the cord, or the sheets. If Hopkins had been on top of Janet during her murder, how did 4 trained professionals miss it? The defense had a theory. They called it DNA transfer. Hopkins' material, deposited during consensual sex weeks earlier, had migrated. Under moisture, pressure, and time, cloth against cloth, it moved. From the nightgown to the cord when Janet was restrained. From the cord to the sheet when her body was covered. Their expert testified that the stains were invisible. Not microscopic traces requiring enhancement, simply invisible to the naked eye. 4 professionals had not been incompetent. They had looked at fabric that showed nothing, because on the surface there was nothing to see. The defense also raised something else. Hopkins was not the only person whose DNA was present. Scott Walsh's DNA appeared on the sheets. A third, unidentified male profile was found on Janet's robe. The prosecution had focused entirely on Hopkins. The other profiles remained unexplained. Then came the moment that should have stopped everything. During cross-examination, Wecht was asked directly whether he could scientifically date when the DNA had been deposited. He said no. He acknowledged that no such test existed, that every expert in the room agreed. There was no forensic method, none, that could determine whether biological material was left on a surface one night or 3 weeks earlier. The jury heard that admission. Then they deliberated for 6 hours and found Scott Hopkins guilty of murder in the 3rd degree. Francesco Caltieri sat in that courtroom and felt something release that he had been holding since he was a young man, standing at his sister's door being held back from seeing her. John. We got him. Hopkins was sentenced to 8 to 16 years in prison. He was 68 years old. His wife Karen left the courthouse not knowing if her husband would ever come home. Hopkins maintained from the first day what he had always said. He did not do it. The appeal began quietly. His attorney filed under the Post-Conviction Relief Act, raising a specific legal challenge. Before trial, Hopkins' defense team had failed to request a Fry hearing, a pre-trial process where a judge evaluates whether an expert's methodology is generally accepted within the scientific community. They had challenged Wecht's theory at trial, but they had never asked a judge to evaluate whether that theory met the legal standard for admissible science before the jury ever heard it. That failure, the appeal argued, had denied Hopkins a fair trial. In April 2020, the Superior Court of Pennsylvania issued a ruling. The court found that Wecht's topographical distribution theory had appeared for the first time as a named methodology during his trial testimony. It was not present in his earlier expert reports. It had not been reviewed for scientific acceptance before the jury heard it. The court wrote it plainly. The theory rested on unscientific conjecture, not a forensic methodology. The Superior Court wrote directly, without Wecht's testimony, the prosecution had no evidence that Hopkins' DNA was deposited on the night of the murder rather than during consensual sex weeks earlier. The conviction was reversed. Hopkins was released on bond. In January 2022, the Beaver County District Attorney moved to dismiss the remaining charges. Gregory Scott Hopkins was formally exonerated. He had served approximately 9 years. In October 2022, Hopkins filed a federal lawsuit against 3 investigators, Andy Gall, Rocco DeMaiolo, and Ashley Mungan. The filing alleged malicious prosecution, fabrication of evidence, and civil conspiracy. It claimed investigators had charged Hopkins despite knowing the evidence was insufficient, that they had built a case around unverifiable science and pursued it anyway. No one else has been charged with Janet Walsh's murder. Francesco Caltieri had burned the newspaper clippings after the 2013 conviction. The headlines that had accumulated for decades. Crime still unsolved. Case gone cold. He had stood over them and let them go. He had thought that was the end of it. It was not. The conviction he had waited his entire adult life for was taken back. The certainty he had finally allowed himself to feel was removed by a court ruling about a theory that a judge decided was not real science. There is no second ending waiting to arrive. The box that sat in a basement in western Pennsylvania with one name written on the side, it still exists. Janet Walsh's murder is listed as unsolved. No one has been convicted. No one is in prison for what happened to her. Janet was 23 years old in 1979. She had been dancing hours before she died. She had been building a new life in a small apartment in Monica, figuring out who she was on her own for the first time. She never got the chance to find out. Somewhere out there, the person responsible for ending Janet Walsh's life woke up the next morning, and every morning after that, for 45 years.